Good morning, everyone. My name is Trudy Morgan, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. Just before we begin the program, I want to provide a bit of technical information in case anyone's having issues. If your internet quality is poor, click on the click here to switch stream area to view the webinar at a lower bandwidth. If you do that, the video quality will decrease, but the audio should remain the same. If you're having any other technical issues, click on Request Help bubble, which is on the bottom right corner of the webcast page. Your help request will be emailed back to you at the email address you provided. So hopefully those two little technical tips will get everybody all organized and we can begin our program today. Even though we're meeting virtually, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am the chair of the Intergovernmental Committee for Economic and Labor Force Development, which we call ICE for short, for obvious reasons. More information about the committee is on our website, which is www.icecommittee.org. In a nutshell, ICE facilitates collaboration among the three orders of government around economic and labor force development in Toronto. Our goal is to break down silos and facilitate information sharing across government. Our activities are made possible by the financial support of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada and the City of Toronto Economic Development and Culture Division. Our activities include identifying topics of collective interest around which we commission research and host forums such as today's events. Our members are drawn from government offices that are involved with either economic or labor force development. And in total, I think we currently represent about 14 different offices and divisions across the three orders of government. Today's forum discusses a research project we commissioned on the use of labor market information by students and job seekers. The study was undertaken by MDB Insights and will be summarized in a few minutes by Chris Bandak and Trudy Parsons. You can download a copy of the final report from the ICE Committee website and also from the webcast page. We then will hear the perspectives of our two panelists. Tony Bonen is the Director of Research Data and Analytics at the Labour Market Information Council. This is a not-for-profit organization that strives to increase access to quality, relevant data and insights across the pan-Canadian LMI ecosystem. And then we have John MacLaughlin, who has a long distinguished career in labor market dynamics, education and training, and recently became the Executive Director of the Toronto Workforce Innovation Group. More information about Chris, Trudy, Tony, and John, and the organizations they represent is on the webcast page. Following the panel discussion, we are reserving 15 to 20 minutes to ask the panel your questions. You may ask a question at any time during the webcast by clicking on the questions tab, typing in your question, and clicking submit. I also, just before we turn to our presentation, I want to also just point out that this webinar wouldn't be possible without the volunteer efforts of our committee members. We have an all hands on deck approach to implementing our work program, but I especially want to acknowledge the contributions of Amel Ahmed, Karen Richards, and Kelvin Wu. Amel initiated the development of the research project and is currently on maternity leave from Innovation Science and Economic Development Canada. I know she registered for today's event, and if her baby is permitting participation, thanks Amel for all your work, and look forward to seeing you back at the committee soon. Karen and Kelvin also worked on the research project and have led the development of today's webinar. Karen works for Service Canada and Kelvin for Innovation Science and Economic Development Canada. And the last thing before I turn the screen over to Chris and Judy is Trudy, I just want to draw your attention to the very important link to a short feedback form. I encourage you to complete it before signing out of the webcast. What you can do is just make the web Click on the link and then you can fill it out after the webcast ends. I'll also be emailing it out to all of you after the session. So without further ado, now I'm going to turn the screen over to Chris Bandak, who will tell you about the research he led on how LMI is used by students and newcomer job seekers. Chris leads MDB Insight's Market Research and Analytics Division. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Judy. Appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everyone. MDB Insight is Canada's leading market research, economic development, and workforce development strategic planning consultancy. I'm Chris Bandak. I head up the Market Research Division and Analytics Department of MDB Insight, and Trudy heads up the Workforce Development, and you'll be hearing from her shortly. So we were contracted by the ICE committee, as Judy made reference to understand the use of labor market information by students and job seekers. There were sort of three key objectives for the study: awareness of resources, ability to effectively use the LMI, and any barriers to the use of LMI. The survey had 5 key stakeholder groups within the Toronto area. Students in high school, we completed 101 surveys. First-year post-secondary students, which we completed 105 surveys, high school guidance counselors, 2 completed interviews, and newcomers seeking employment services. We did 66 interviews, and immigrant employment service advisors, to which we did 4 completed interviews. Some of the challenges and adaptations for the students, obviously, we would have to go through an ethics review process. We completed all of the applications across TDSB and TCD, SB, and Toronto post-secondary institutions. It was a lengthy process, required quite a bit of documents to be filled out, only to find out that there was a teacher strike, which forced us to sort of switch gears and move in a different direction at the beginning of the project. And therefore, we ended up switching to a panel methodology for the quantitative part of the student surveys. And we used a panel to collect that data. And that really helped us out in terms of completing that. Newcomer recruiting, we mobilized through ICE committees network among local immigration partnerships. And the online survey link was shared through those organizations where they could push out the email with the URL to complete the survey, and in booths run by the Toronto LIPs. So looking first at the level of awareness of LMI, or that the government publishes LMI information, you can see that there's a definite increase as you move from secondary to post-secondary up to newcomers, with 57.5% either very aware and somewhat aware. And this sort of intuitively makes sense, as you would expect, as engagement level or interest in finding employment, or that the critical nature of finding employment increases, you can see that the awareness also increases. So this seemed like an intuitive result. But again, awareness at the highest for newcomers, and followed by post-secondary and secondary. We then asked about their usage of LMI resources. And again, we see sort of a similar trend, 18.8% of secondary students, followed by 43.8% of usage amongst post-secondary, and 66 or 2/3 with newcomers. Again, this seems somewhat intuitive, thinking about the nature of what's required in your life stage. Then we asked about the impact on academic choices and course selection. And we see a bit of a shift here in terms of the results, where secondary, post-secondary have the highest percentage of those who said it made a significant impact on their academic and career choice. And again, this I think makes sense given that they're at that stage in their life where they're looking for careers, they're looking for ways to focus their education to meet a career where there might be more demand. And we have 82% for newcomers. Again, slightly lower, possibly because they're already at that stage where they've made some of those decisions. So, change at that point might not be as relevant as it is amongst students. Next, we asked about difficulty in finding the LMI resources. And we can see that newcomers had a significantly higher difficulty, or the percentage of those having difficulty was higher for newcomers versus post-secondary, with secondary students having the least amount of difficulty. In terms of understanding the LMI resources, we sort of see a flat range here. Again, there's some small variations. I'm not sure I would say these are, completely statistically different. So all in around the 40% range for having difficulty in understanding the resources. In other words, more than the majority, or 60%, are actually understanding the resources. We then asked about likelihood to use LMI in the future, and some very positive results here. Again, we see secondary students in around the 76.2% mark, post-secondary up around 85%, and newcomers with the highest percentage at 87.9%. Again, some hypotheses on why these numbers are, but I think we're going to speak to that a little bit later with some of the questions. So newcomer specific questions. Again, some of these questions were targeted directly to the newcomers, and we asked them if the resources helped them in their job search, and you can see 57.8% agreed that it did actually help. And we asked about, are they currently looking or interested in changing jobs? And we can see close to 80%, or just under 80%, were in the market. And then we asked about their skills versus qualifications, and 65.5% indicated that they felt they were overqualified for the job market available. 31% felt that their skills were a good match to what's available, and 3.4% indicated that skills were required that they might have to change or update. I'm now going to pass it over to Trudy.
Sorry, can everyone hear me, hopefully?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, or good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. So as Chris indicated, I mean, the intent of the research was really to inform around understanding and use of the of LMI. And, for those that are participating on the conference call this morning, we're familiar with the complexity of LMI. One of the groups that was targeted, and I just want to reiterate that, there were 2 interviews that were conducted specifically with guidance counselors, in part because of the constraints in actually accessing guidance counselors during the time that the research was happening. But I think that the learning that we've taken away from this can certainly be applied to a much broader base of guidance counselors that work within our education sector. So, when we think about how LMI is being used in our school system, there is a recognition that it is part of the career classes that are, delivered on an ongoing basis. However, there is also a recognition that it has greater usage beyond just the career classes. So one of the things that we had some confirmation of, and specifically related to this research, was that it is being used in the career class. Excuse me, guidance counselors are using things like assignments and research projects to encourage students to actually use the information. So, as part of that process, it's finding the information, what information is relevant, and then how do we actually utilize that information to inform the decision-making process. We know that when we look at this from a student perspective, we understand that there is, again, significant opportunity to improve the awareness of LMI, how it's used, why it's used, who should be using it. And so, again, it's not just about, informing potentially, career choices or understanding specifically what the employment potential might be within a particular geography or within a particular sector. But we recognize and understand that this information can also be used to help students understand more clearly what the specific skills, knowledge, and abilities are that they need to be developing if they are to be successful in pursuing a particular career path, whether that's directly from school to work, or whether that's, from school to a learning post-secondary opportunity or apprenticeship opportunity. But if we have a better understanding of what the skills are that employers are seeking, then it certainly helps the students with everything from, choosing particular career pathways or education pathways, but it also helps to inform even in course selection when they're going through that process while they're walking through their high school years. One of the other things that was identified, sorry, Chris, can you just go back for 1 sec? Thank you. One of the other things that was identified, again, is the recognition that, if only there was more money, everything comes down to the dollars and cents of this. And so, of course, the more of a commitment within our funding institutions to ensuring that LMI is available, that it is accessible, that it is useful, and that it's usable, I think, the greater the opportunity is that we can really strengthen the use of LMI as an invaluable tool to inform that decision-making process. And that was something that was identified through the student outreach specifically about how do we better support our education sector in accessing and using LMI. Thanks, Chris. So when we talked to the newcomer advisors, and how LMI is being used, certainly when we think about the bridging programs that are available, it's essential to understand, again, both from that skills perspective as well as from the opportunity perspective, how can we be using that information to help our newcomers explore more deeply the pathways or the employment opportunities that may exist? How may their existing credentials support and be utilized to inform that decision-making process? And of course, that speaks to the reaccreditation that we know that a lot of newcomers have to go through. There's also a significant value in MLI in understanding the transferability of the skills that they're already bringing, that they have demonstrated expertise or knowledge in, and how those skills can be utilized in other career pathways, potentially in even other sectors, in addition to other occupations. We do know that a lot of the organizations are supporting newcomers in the geography across Canada, actually, but this is specifically looking at the Toronto area, that there are a lot of great dashboards that are being created, and these dashboards provide, at a glance, information to support that decision-making and exploration process. And of course, then, one of the other things that came out loud and clear was the importance of having newcomers talking to newcomers. So how can we utilize testimonials, perhaps captured through, quick videos or some type of promotional materials that allow newcomers to learn from the experience of others that have walked their path, relocating into Canada or into the Toronto area. What was their path? What did it look like? And how might that information be passed along so that, they can be better informed again about potentially what sources are available to inform on those career pathways or those education decisions. So I think it's really important to understand and to learn from the input that was received through the engagement process, because I think that it sets the stage for some very clear recommendations and some very clear actions that can result out of this research. And of course, that's the ultimate goal of any research that's carried out, is how do we make things better, easier, improved? And really that, I think, is where we'll delve into some of that when we get into the Q&A. Thanks very much. I'll pass it over to Tony, I believe.
Great, thank you very much, Trudy. And thank you as well to the ICE committee for inviting me here, particularly Karen and Judy. Much appreciated, always happy to speak to these types of topics, and especially important work like this, trying to figure out where the LMI gaps exist, what is working, what is not working, to better inform how we can improve the LMI system. As Judy had mentioned, the Labour Market Information Council, we are a nonprofit organization whose mandate is to collect, analyze, and distribute labor market information and data. For us, that primarily means delivering that information in a contextualized way to the broad world of intermediaries. That's our word for it, at least, which would include guidance counselors, employment service providers, all the people sort of at the front line giving that like qualitative, contextualized information. But for many of these people, finding high quality information and understanding the limits to the information that's out there is key. And that's really where we focus on as an organization. What struck me about this report is how much it aligns with some of the work we had done a couple of years ago. We did a number of public opinion research surveys targeting specific groups. Luckily, this was during a time where there weren't teacher strikes or a global pandemic, which is a much better time to conduct surveys, just generally, if you're thinking of conducting one. But what stood out and aligns very much with what we have seen is this idea that a majority, but a slim majority, think finding and understanding labor market information is easy. Also around 50–60% said it's easy or relatively easy, but that means 2 to 5 people are having challenges. We saw that in our surveys of recent immigrants, recent graduates from post-secondary education. We didn't survey specifically high school students, but I think what was found in this report aligns with what we would expect as well. On the one hand, that's good. A majority, yes, think it's relatively easy, but that still leaves a big significant minority who are requiring some kind of better information packaged in a useful and accessible sort of manner, as was mentioned earlier. The other thing that really came through is how impactful labor market information is when it's used. Large majorities, when they use LMI or report using LMI, say that it's affecting their decisions. In some cases, it's a significant impact. In some cases, it's reaffirming the decisions that they've already made, which I think is actually quite a good thing to have. It's not bad to have already chosen your sort of passion of what you want to study, what you want to be, especially at a young age. And if you find LMI that aligns with that and sort of solidifies your decision, that's perfectly okay. And in some cases might shift people away, but having that sort of background of hard data to support the direction you're already going in, I think only makes people feel more confident in the decisions they're making, especially at an early age or at an early point in their life in Canada. So I think that's something that is very positive and we want to continue to encourage. 2 other sort of broad things that came out of this as well is the importance of information on wages and benefits. Of course, that's what everybody wants. They want to know how much they're going to earn. And for us at LMIC, we recognize that, but it's also a big challenge when you think about what the averages are across a wide group of different employment types. Like an extreme example might be actors. The average across all actors of what they earn is probably relatively low. But of course, there are some outliers who are making lots of money. So how you put that into context for people, especially young people, to understand that, I think is a big challenge that working with employment service providers, counselors is key to doing that, because just having a dashboard, which we love building, or reporting the data, which we love doing, is not sufficient to get that into the minds of young people or people who aren't deeply involved in the world of LMI. The other big piece that comes out as a common requirement in labor market information, or desire, is skills information. And this is one at LMIC we spent a lot of time sort of trying to work with our federal partners on defining skill indicators, using online job posting data to identify work requirements requested by employers. And it's a challenge. It's very difficult. It's skills are not well defined as a category. There are very different and diverse sources of information. So getting that in a form and type that makes sense to people is a challenge that I think we'll have for a while, but one that is sort of at the top of our agenda. On that point on skills, one of the things that I found most interesting, thinking of our role of delivering labor market information to the world of employment service providers, counselors, and so on, was some of these comments around the desire to have soft skills information. What are the soft skills required for certain jobs and occupations? That stood out to me because it was a little bit different than what I would have expected, in that very often soft skills, especially the type of skills identified in online job posting information, are very common. Oral communication is listed in something like 70 or 80% of online job postings. Is that relevant? Yes, it's relevant, but will it get you the job? Not entirely sure that that's going to be the thing that tips you over. In some of the conversations we've had with more the employer side, for them, it's like the hard skills, the technical knowledge or background is sort of the basic need that you have to have in order to be considered for the position. But then it is the soft skills, I think, that really help you make that difference or stand out versus the other people who are looking for work in what's an increasingly competitive market right now. So I think that adds to the challenge of defining skills well, because soft skills by their nature are a bit amorphous. How do you define them? How do you measure them? How important they are? And what does this particular soft skill, like teamwork or time management, mean to that employer? And for us, even no matter how far we get with the data, that is always going to be a limitation that we face. And that, again, is why it's so important to work with sort of the frontline people, taking the hard data and contextualizing it. On that last point, actually just before this meeting, we were having a bit of discussion about the importance of understanding the limits of labor market information, labor market data. And one of the things that also stood out to me in reading the report was the comment from, I think it was one of the newcomers, saying that they wanted labor market information on psychotherapists as a particular subfield that for them is quite different than psychotherapy as a broader field. Very interesting. Extremely unlikely that we'll ever have hard numbers on psychotherapists, simply because there's not enough to accurately survey and provide good information. That's not to say that the data, that information in a qualitative form shouldn't be provided. It should, but it means understanding that getting hard numbers on that kind of detailed level of granular occupations is always going to be a challenge. And I'm not sure that we'll ever have the sample size large enough to get good numbers on that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to go as far as we can with the data, but recognize that there will be limits, and that's where the qualitative dialogue sort of comes in. And I think that's a big challenge. And as an economist myself, I think that's probably the biggest challenge, because it seems like a big, difficult thing to deal with. And so I'm happy dealing with the data side and then trying to communicate where those limits are and then finding the nice middle point between those two sides. So I'll pause there and perhaps turn things over to John and then ask a few questions later on. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Tony. Everyone can hear me, I hope. Went quiet for a second. Yeah, that was a very good segue because both in my current work and in past work, I get almost an email every day from someone after 40 years of a life misspent in dealing with labor market information. I often have to answer a question, whether it's an email from someone, John, where are the jobs? And normally what they're asking is, where are jobs going to be in the next week, the next 2 months, 1 year and out, right? So this is the practical challenges around trying to articulate labor market information. If you're an employment counselor, you want to be able to you want to hear very specific things, like someone should be looking to become a line cook, or perhaps a second language instructor, or something of that nature. And of course, I spend, I think, about half of my time describing, this is what I'm going to tell you, right? So yes, the job prospects for line cook and chef and other things looks positive, but, right? So there's always a but, right? Because the most accurate labor market information is actually looking backwards, right? So you're looking backwards at what were the occupations that grew the month before, the year before, etc. So we can try and project those things out into the future, but there are some limitations. Just because, there was a massive transit operators hired last month does not necessarily mean that they will be hired the following month. I often feel like we are stockbrokers in advising clients on where we believe stocks will increase, right? So, as I said, from a lived experience, I was trying to add up this morning how many high schools I've done labor market presentations to. And I think I had to stop at 100, right? And the kids are always fascinating because they want to say, what occupation am I going to get the kind of money in order that I can buy a Lamborghini, right? They're often not thinking, in those kind of terms. And sometimes we get lost in the weeds, right? And so my response is stay in school, right? Complete your high school diploma, go to college, go to university. And when you get a job, continue to learn, because that's the one real truth we know about the labor market. Returns to education pay off. We all like to have those stories about someone who dropped out of high school or college. It's what I call Shark Tank analysis, i.e., I know someone who didn't complete high school and are now making $1 million, right? The reality, those things are outliers, right? So again, what I try and emphasize, and Tony touched on the limitations, that we need to be clear about what those limitations are, right? And also dig down into those limitations and find out where the real truths lie, right? And I know Trudy, myself, Tony, we all also face governmental pressures, right? I know that's a bit of a secret, right? So that they say, well, these are where the jobs are. This is where we think wages are going to increase. And as we're aware, there's a lot of players in the labor market space. And there's often a desire to overproject those numbers, to overproject wages. So if I can be so bold, skilled trades, right? So, we face pressure, and there is wage increase, there are job increases and those sorts of things. But when we talk to kids, we also need to tell them around the challenges, right? The type of work, the environmental characteristics of those jobs. This is what I call sort of what we often miss is dispositional characteristics, right? So if a kid or a young adult doesn't like working in the cold, becoming an industrial electrician is probably not their job, right? And furthermore, we also need to let them know that only 40% of all people who go down the path to becoming an industrial electrician become one, right? So this is what I call the element of honesty in LMI, right? And its limitations. So, you know, one of my questions, given what we know, right, to Chris and perhaps Trudy as well, how do we build in the understanding of what those limitations are without devaluing the overall pieces of labor market information?
Sorry, I just had to unmute there. So Chris, I'll take a stab at it and feel free to jump in and add to that. I mean, John, as you were talking, the thing that really resonated with me is that with any data source, we can't just simply look at the data. We have to look at the story behind the data. And to me, that's the on-the-ground conversations, the experience sharing, the life experiences of somebody who is an industrial millwright, or somebody who is a mechanical engineer, or what's the lived experience of somebody working in that particular occupation. And I think that's where the story starts to emerge about, yes, the job may be in demand, yes, the job may pay $100,000 a year, but in order to make that $100,000, I'm working an 80-hour week 40 weeks of the year. And I'm working in frigid temperatures, from November to March. If that rest of the story doesn't resonate with the person who's pursuing that as a career choice, then to your point, maybe it's time to rethink the career path that I'm actually pursuing. So I think we need to balance the numbers with the on-the-ground experience. I think that's critical. And I'm not sure that we do a really good job of that right now. A lot of our emphasis is placed on the numbers. How many job postings are there for a particular occupation? But there's two things with that information. We do need to balance it with the local story, but we also need to look at that from a local perspective. And far too often, the data that we have available to us, and this is not a criticism, it's just a reality that the data doesn't necessarily cover the geography in which I'm wanting to look at working in. And so that creates a challenge. We know that the economic regions are vast, and a lot of the data is presented looking at an economic region or a region that's structured under some other format, but it includes communities that are not within my reach because of travel distance or whatever the case may be. So I think we need to constantly keep a lens on the locality of the information. I think that's critical. And I think we need to do a better job of inserting real lived experiences within the data side of things to make sure that the information is much more balanced when we're presenting this information out, whether it be to students or job seekers or newcomers or whoever is generally looking for that information in the labor market.
I think it also, if I could add a little to that, I think it also speaks to the required continuity between the entire chain. In other words, the LMI data, as was mentioned by both Tony as well, that it can only give so much, it can only be so granular. And therefore, I think the experience that a student has to work closely with the counselors in that school, and they need to understand that student, what their capabilities are, what maybe would suit them more, so that they can use that data in a way that is going to be productive with them going into the future. As you mentioned, John, when you said, maybe they don't want to work in the cold. Well, LMI is not going to tell them that, but LMI is going to give them an idea of what they might want to do. But it's up to the counselors and that level to then take that data, work with the student, and help them come up with a plan that kind of brings those two things together. And I think that's the piece that maybe needs a lot of work going into the future.
Yep, great points, Chris. Thanks.
John, did you have any other questions for Trudy and Chris?
Yeah, what jobs do you learn to unmute yourself? Because clearly that's something we'll learn still. Thanks for the answers. What I was wondering, and obviously this will have occurred after you were writing the report, and this may also be a question for Tony, is, the big elephant that's in the room is COVID, right? And do we have any sort of sense about how valid past LMI projections and pieces are going to be affected by COVID? Again, I'm thinking of this as my immediate response because I get emails about this all the time. How do we see COVID and the impacts that have been caused over the last 6 months, 7 months, playing out in a longer term basis in terms of labor market information?
Tony, that seems a great question for you.
Yeah, it fits quite well because I spoke on another panel a couple of weeks ago, particularly on this question. Mostly, we don't really know anything about how the labor market is going to evolve in the next 6 to 18 months. There are people sort of making some guesses right now, us included, sort of looking at the data, trying to understand where things will go. But so much depends on the vaccines that, great news in a couple of weeks that hopefully will get rolled out. I saw some news item the other day that maybe by the end of next year, that most Canadians will have access to the vaccines. That's fantastic. That'll be a big impact, of course, on the speed with which we can recover. But no matter how fast we recover or don't, there has been a huge amount of job loss, as you know, and of course, reduction in hours worked. There's been a great deal of recovery, but even the net change from where we were in February to where we are now is still a big drop. And that's ignoring the real impacts on people's lives in the intervening 7 months. Now, to your particular question on how reliable are past projections, so I should give a bit of a warning and background. I have in another life done a lot of forecasting work, not in labor market work, and I am extremely skeptical of most econometric projections of where things will go. That said, I think they give us general indications. So one of the things that we were looking at recently was the ESTC, the COP's 10-year forecast of employment. And of course, I made this little plot where you can see that the forecast is just this kind of straight line going up slowly over time. But you compare that to what's actually happened, and there's been this massive dip, and we're still well below that line. No surprise there. So in terms of where past projections were on employment level, way off, way off. And we don't know how quickly we'll catch up to pre-COVID trends. But what is interesting is when you look at the largest occupations and the fastest growing jobs, or the jobs that were predicted to grow the fastest before COVID hit, it lines up with what you might think of now qualitatively. In essence, it is jobs in sort of managerial areas, human resources, finance, occupations in business management or advertising and marketing as one broad category. IT type jobs is another big expected to grow fast area. So computer programmers, information systems analysts, and so on. And then healthcare and education are the other two big areas, in particular registered nurses, nurses' aides, and so on. And then elementary school teachers and social community service workers. These are sort of the big areas that are large in terms of the amount of people employed, as well as what is projected to be the fastest growing prior to COVID. But those 4 broad areas line up very much with what I would expect to grow the quickest, not be hurt the most in the current climate. And it speaks to, John, the point you were saying earlier about this idea of being able, staying in school as long as you can. And at a sort of micro level, if you were giving advice to an individual, it's probably what I would recommend. I mean, the fact that we all are working right now and can do so remotely has a lot to do with probably the university education that we received. But for many people, that's not going to be the path for them. And we need to think about how to support them and get them through this period so that in the skilled trades and so on that we need people to work in to keep the economy going, that they aren't going to be so negatively impacted when there are ups and downs. I mean, this is quite an extreme shock, of course, but I'm not sure exactly how to do that. That relates to the broader labor market policy world and support systems, think of EI and CERB, the Qs, all of that. But yes, I think there are some still nuggets of truth in pre-COVID forecasts, but distinguishing what is reliable and what's not, it's more at this, again, this level of general trends that we can see and that we were expecting. And in terms of specific forecasts, I don't think there's anything that we can really use pre-COVID for precise estimates.
Perfect. I think, John, we've time probably for you to ask about one more question, and then we'll see what questions Tony has.
No, I'm good. That was, I'll pass the torch over to Tony.
Pass it over to Tony then.
Great. Well, thank you. Related to sort of the discussion we're having just before I went on my rant about forecasting, job pathways is something else that came up in the discussion here and also is in the report, and the importance of presenting job pathways as sort of a qualitative piece of information. So young people, again, especially can understand what is possible for them going this way or that way. My big question is, how do you go about developing good, high quality maps or visualizations or even just dialogues around what's possible? Like you finish high school or you go to university or do a trade program, what happens afterwards? I think that's very important. It comes up a lot in these sort of discussions. And it's something that I struggle with understanding how to begin and how to get that kind of information into that. So I was wondering if you, Trudy or Chris, had any insights on where to start on something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. You know, if we all take a moment and just think back to where we started ourselves and kind of look at the pathway that we followed. You know, I remember I'm 15 years old and I started working at a restaurant in my hometown back in Newfoundland, and, you know, never dreamed of, you know, at 15 years old, I'm not thinking about, is this what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? And then, you know, life kind of takes on its own pathway. And, you know, here I am today as, you know, in a lead in a national organization supporting communities and people across the country on how to do exactly what you're talking about. You know, how do we make sure that our local businesses have the talent that they need, and how do we make sure that our local residents and labor force participants are following a pathway that leads them to quality work with, you know, quality of life and all of the things that we strive for. So one of the tools that I've come across of late is a tool that was developed actually out of the UK, and it's a career lattice. And so maybe I'll just speak briefly to that. We just actually worked with a group out of Toronto in creating a career lattice pathway specifically for hospitality occupations within the, this was specifically related to the Toronto airport sort of catchment area. And it was a really cool project that allowed us to identify the specific occupations within that sector, and then to make direct connections between those occupations, looking at the skill levels and the education levels that are required. So that as an individual, you know, starting out as a server in a restaurant, I could follow a pathway by looking at this career lattice, whether it was a lateral move or whether it was a promotion or whether it was something that was perhaps less stressful and I wanted to kind of take a step back down. But I think the more that we can create those tools that allow people to actually explore where to from here, what's the opportunity, what's the potential? Because, you know, a lot of us, and I'll certainly speak from my own perspective, it sort of happened haphazardly. You know, I moved from one thing into the next, and I went to post-secondary and landed somewhere. And then, you know, that led me to something else. And when I look at my career trajectory, it's like, wow, you know, it probably touched 6 or 7 key points. Now, we know today career pathways oftentimes are going to touch 20 key points just because of the nature of the work and where we're going. But I guess to answer your question specifically around those job pathways, I know there's amazing work that's being done in our school systems in creating career pathways that demonstrate to students, you know, if you've completed high school, these are the types of occupations that you can expect to be successful in getting into. If you go on to a college level education, here's the types of occupations that would be available. If you go to post-secondary at the university level, here's the types of occupations that you can experience. And I'm reminded of a story of a young lady. I worked in the Niagara region. Actually, I was an equivalent to John in the Niagara Workforce Planning Board many years ago. And I remember the story of this young lady who worked in the hotel industry. And she was attending post-secondary and needed a part-time job to support, you know, her studies. Started working at, I think her first job was in housekeeping, where she moved into front desk. And in a 7-year time span, this lady moved from being in housekeeping to being the head of their human resources department. And it always stuck with me. You know, I'm sure she never imagined when she started in housekeeping that, you know, that's where she would land at the end of the day. And so I think the more that we can create visualization of those pathways and get those into the hands of students and job seekers, the better we are going to see successful pathways for those individuals. Because at the end of the day, everybody's looking for the good job. You know, I remember reading a book that was done by the head of Ipsos, I think it was. And it was all about, you know, what does the world want? We don't want world peace. We don't want to win a world. We're not going to be crowned, you know, as the beauty pageant winner for the world. We want good jobs. And those good jobs result in decent wages and, you know, allow us to have a decent quality of life. So I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to be presenting tools and resources to individuals that are easy to use, that make sense, and allow them to explore the possibilities.
I would just add to that a little bit, Tony, from a data perspective too. I think it's about getting data from more than one source. And I'm sure you know this and everyone here knows this, but it's not just about the students and school. It's about programs. It's about the future of technology, the future of jobs and manufacturing and all those different types of NAICS codes and where they're going and what's likely to be forecasted. And then bringing in the availability of jobs, and it's somehow coming up with a system where there's open communication between all of those areas so that informed decisions can be made from everybody, from those who are hiring to those who are looking, those who are planning their education. And you know, I'm sure that's a bit of a leap, but I think, you know, that's the end goal. Having all that information shared will result in, you know, schools developing programs that are in line with where, you know, jobs are going and students being communicated about those what's happening and where the jobs are going to be. And if you can have that all working together, I mean, it requires a lot of data and a lot of data from a lot of different sources, but bringing that together really is I guess, the nirvana of where you want to go.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. And I think pulling together information from different sources is definitely where you want to go, especially when you're thinking about forward-looking information. And I mean, John had mentioned as well, this desire of people to understand how jobs and how industries will be evolving. And it's very difficult. And I think you need to have both the quantitative sort of forecasting stuff like COPs and whatever, but that was sort of the individual stories and a variety of them that can give some more context. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. If I can move on to maybe the next question. I have a bunch, but I'll limit the number that I actually pose here. I wanted to go back to this idea of the soft skills being particularly necessary. This coming from the career counselors who were interviewed as part of this work. And they mentioned specifically examples like communication skills, time management. And as I said, that kind of it's not that it surprised me, it's just I often think of hard skills as being the thing that like students and newcomers want to know. But it seems like soft skills are actually a bit more important. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on these, balancing these two areas and how these two types of skills, ill-defined as they are, hard and soft, are important to communicate to people and what that means in terms of sort of delivering the information to them.
Yeah, great question. In the work that we do, we have the opportunity to work across the country and even in the US. And a big part of the work that we do is talking directly to employers. And I can tell you that I don't even recall a time when in my conversations with employers, Tony, around skills, that soft skills has not been the first thing that they talk about. And you made a point earlier, talking about sort of the hard skills as being the baseline for, if I'm applying for a position, if the employer is looking for specific technical type skills, I need to have those as my base. And you're absolutely right. It's no sense of me applying to be a mechanical engineer because I have none of the technical skills that would allow me to do that work. But employers have identified time and time again, if someone has that baseline of those technical skills, and if they can demonstrate to me that they have the soft skills, that they know how to problem solve, that they know how to communicate, that they know how to deal with conflict, I remember an employer one time saying to me, I need somebody to understand that while it may not be my fault, it is my problem. So I may not have been the one that caused this customer to be upset, but because I am an employee in this company, it's still my problem to help to solve. And, showing up on time and showing up, period. I've had employers, especially, in the construction sector, bring up time and time again that, payday is on Thursday and, no one shows up on Friday. So, it's those core, basic, fundamental skills. You talked about communication skills. It's those core skills that if you're going to do your job effectively and efficiently, you have to have that base. And I think we all struggle with finding ways to measure the soft skills within individual performance. But I think we also struggle with how to articulate the core importance of those skills to job seekers, to students, to our employees. And so I'm not surprised that guidance counselors talked about the need for those soft skills. I think through some of the tools that we have available, and I'll refer back to, the job posting tools that, the big data analytic tools that are utilizing job postings to access some of this information. I know, Tony, you at LMIC are using it. John, I know you mentioned Vicinity earlier. If we're looking at 1 million job postings and we're able to extract out those soft skills, we're able to see what the soft skills are that employers are really placing emphasis on. And I think that in turn helps guidance counselors to demonstrate to the students, look, 987,000 times employers identified, soft skills or verbal skills or oral skills or writing skills or whatever they are as being critical. And then how do we demonstrate that we have that ability as an individual applying for that position? So I think there's a lot of work to be done around soft skills, but I think it is critical. And just to kind of balance that a little bit, the other piece to that I think that's really important is I think there is an opportunity to educate employers more on skills in general. Because oftentimes when we do these outreach to employers, they're identifying work requirements and not a skill. And so how do we help people understand what's a skill and what's a work requirement? Because they're two very different things. So again, I think it's an education, even just around the language, so that we're all talking the same language, I think would be an important aspect to that.
Yeah, I wonder if I could jump in just for one moment, because I've had the fortune or misfortune over the last 40 years to have looked at a whole variety of industry sectors, right? And maybe as the parent of a 15-year-old, I have particular views as well. I constantly hear about soft skills and employability skills. And as I often tell someone when they say, we have to find a way to measure that. And I say, gosh, if you can figure that out, you're going to make $5 million right off the bat.
Yeah.
But one of the things I like to do, and I did this a few years ago, was, in working in an industry sector, I had all of these quotes about employees not showing up on time, not being focused, not dressing correctly, using incorrect language, right? So I had all these quotes from employers, and they were going, yes, this is the exact problem with millennials. Thank you, John, for itemizing this out. And I went, well, actually, no, this came from an employer interviews back in 1910, right? That the reality is that youth act like youth, right? That employers really want everyone to be 40 years old, have a family, need the income, be reliable, etc. Those things are hard to inculcate into younger people, who may not have the life strings that if I showed you around here that each of us have, right? So I think it's like trying to find the balance around telling employers, you know what? The time you spend working with individuals to develop their soft skills, because most of those we learn on the job, right? If we think about it, how did we learn to show up on time, right? We learned it because someone told us, if you don't show up on time tomorrow, I'm going to fire you, right? There's nothing like that can possibly occur. So this is an ongoing struggle. Are there things that we can do? Yeah, I think so. But we also need to be realistic that we're not going to suddenly turn millennials or whatever gen we come up with next, that we're not going to suddenly turn them into 40-year-olds. And we need to work with employers to understand how they can best incorporate youth into their structures.
Yeah. I just need to share one thought, and I've said this for many years, this starts obviously in the home, but I think it also starts in the school system. And we need to start talking to students about this in kindergarten. you know, and it builds over time. It's like, you know, any habit that we have, we know it takes 21 days to sort of develop it as a habit. And I think that we need to be a lot more aware of where the opportunities exist to drive, John, your exact points. You know, how do we drive home that, you know, as I'm starting my career, there's an opportunity here for the employer to help to ensure that those soft skills are also being developed. But there needs to be a commitment on the part of me as an employee to recognize that there are certain expectations that are required on my end as well.
Yeah. Sorry, Chris?
I was just going to say, it's funny, this brings me back sort of to I used to be a pricing consultant, and we would do pricing strategy across the world and help companies understand what attributes sort of contribute to the value of a product. And listening to this conversation, so interesting, because really soft skills are what I would call a threshold attribute. They're an attribute that don't get you value. They don't bring a premium, but they're required, you know, as an entry point to have a product. You think of a cell phone. Cell phones today, I mean, they do everything. But as a basic phone, you never hear companies talk about like the call quality or its ability to just make a simple phone call. And that's because it's a threshold attribute. It's a requirement. You can't have a smartphone that doesn't make a phone call, but you'll never hear a company talk about the ability to make a call. And I think soft skills are very much a threshold attribute. It is just a requirement. And I think, as Trudy mentioned, and as everyone else mentioned, it has to be ingrained in the household, in schools, and all the way through the education system. I think that's where soft skills need to maybe be communicated better and help younger generations understand how critical it is. It's not going to get them anything, but it may just get them a job, because without it, they're not going to survive.
I think that's a great comment. Tony, did you have one last question for the panelists, or should we move to the audience questions, which are coming in fast and furious?
Two very, very quick points just to round up that discussion. Yeah, Chris, I couldn't agree more that the burden now more than ever is on the education systems to inculcate those soft skills, especially now, to John's point, that you develop so many of them in your first jobs as a young person. I mean, I certainly did. I think probably all of us did. And youth employment has been so massively affected in this crisis that many people are going to miss out on those opportunities. And quick second point is, John, don't worry, millennials will soon be 40-year-olds, so don't worry about that.
Lovely, lovely. Good. Well, as I mentioned, we are getting quite a few questions in from the audience, which is wonderful. Keep them coming, please. I wish I could just ask people to raise their hands, but unfortunately, this is a little bit of you email someone who emails me, and then so it's a bit of a train, but we'll do the best we can. First of all, there is a couple of technical questions for Chris, which I think we might as well probably have fairly short, simple answers. One is regarding the surveys. Did we get any information on the demographics and the occupations of the newcomers who participated in the survey? I don't personally recollect whether that was included in the survey, but do we know the breakdown by socioeconomics or demographics or educational background or their occupation?
We definitely had some demographics. I couldn't tell you exactly what they all are right here, right now, but that's something we could provide to participants after the fact. But there were definitely demographics in there.
Perfect. Do you recollect any overall trends that might be like in terms of relationships?
Chris, I actually have a copy of the report here. If you want, I can just share a couple of the findings.
Yeah.
So one of the questions we asked was, how long have they lived in Canada? And 95% indicated more than 5 years. 95% percent indicated English as their first or primary language. It was pretty much an even split between gender and, oh, sorry, I'm looking at secondary students. My apologies. I'm supposed to look at newcomers. 18% were in Canada more than 5 years, 81% less than 5. Yeah. 53% identified other languages, but 44% identified English as their primary. Again, pretty much an even split between male and female. And about 85% of the respondents were over the age of 30.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I don't think there were any key statistical differences between demographic groups for the types of questions that we answered, which is why it wasn't a key part of the report.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Hopefully the person who asked that question found that useful too. Okay, so now this question is a little bit more sweeping. And probably all of the panelists may have a comment. So I'm going to read the question and then we can decide who wants to take a first stab at answering it. As a result of COVID and its impact on the economy, LMI is going to be needed more than ever. If you were able to make one system change to make LMI accessible and relevant, what would it be? So one system change that would make LMI more accessible and relevant to people who perhaps have lost their jobs due to COVID or are looking for, other alternatives. It's a pretty hard question. Maybe the person with the answer will also be a billionaire, but does anyone want to take a first stab at answering that?
I'm happy to just offer the quick thought that came to my mind, and then Tony, not to put you on the spot, but you may want to pick this up. If there was one thing I think that we need to have a better understanding of right now, it's the skills transferability between occupations. Because we know that there are many occupations, and I just think of hospitality and tourism, where we know that even when it recovers, I still do not think that it's going to recover to the same degree of employment opportunities as what we have seen in the past. And, so where do those individuals look for new opportunities? And understanding the skills transferability between what they were doing and what they might be doing, I think is going to be a critical piece of information that'll help inform those career pathways. Over to you, Tony.
That's a perfect segue, Trudy, actually. Yes, skills, number one. Now, what that means in terms of system change, I think skill transferability is a big part, but also understanding where skills can be developed at any point in your life or career pathway. So if you are in one occupation or one kind of pathway and you want to switch, what are the deltas? What's missing between where you are now and where you want to be? And where can you go and find the training or experience necessary to fill that gap? And I think that's an extremely difficult question, but I think that would be the biggest thing that we could do.
Perfect. Does anyone else have any comments? Okay, so here's another really thought-provoking question. I see two missing links in the process on using LMI. The end user, the student or the job seeker, and employment staff or counselors don't have or use must be in-depth information on their workforce development practices and knowledge to provide relevant practical information to the need of the job seeker or student. So that's the one gap. The end user or the counselor don't have or use in depth, it must be information on their workforce development practices and knowledge to provide the relevant practical information to the needs of the job seeker or student. And then the process of how to find a job and embedding the LMI is not embedded in depth in the practice outside of being except at a superficial level. Was this issue identified or addressed in our study? How do you break this and change the system to change the workforce development process? to be in line with the more disruptive nature of today's labor market? Again, a really million-dollar question. I suspect, Trudy, do you want to take a stab at that one too first? And then maybe John and Tony have some thoughts.
So I'm not really clear, Judy, on that. That was a lengthy question with a lot of information in there. So a couple of thoughts that came to mind. I think that there is an opportunity for us to do a better job of equipping our employment support organizations that are working directly with the clients with access to the information that they need to do their jobs. So, we talked about sort of that in-depth LMI. And I think superficially, people have access to the information. So, what jobs are growing, what jobs are declining, what might be the top skills in a particular occupation. But to start to delve a little bit deeper, into a day in the life of a mechanical engineer, that's not at their fingertips. And so I think that number one, I think we need to do a better job of educating and informing and making available the right information to our employment support organizations so that their staff have the information that they need in order to do the best job that they're working so hard to do. And around finding the jobs, we need to do a better job of communicating that information on a local level. Because again, knowing that there are, X number of job opportunities, in a particular region does not necessarily help me as somebody who lives, an hour and a half away from the full extent of that region. So what are the jobs within my community or within my labor shed that I'm willing to travel within in order to access that opportunity for employment? I'm not sure if that answered the question because it was a pretty complex question, but I think our email addresses are included. So we can, whoever asked that question, I'm happy to have them reach out and we can have a deeper conversation.
Perfect, thank you. Does anyone else have any comment? John, you're raising your hand.
And I'm trying to interpret the question as well. And again, because I get asked this almost on a daily basis, right, from an employment counselor, right? Well, one of the challenges, again, of being around for so long, right? John, can you give me an answer? Where are the occupations this client should be looking for, right? And, I try and be careful to say, do you want me to lie, right? The reality is we can only be so precise, right? And Trudy's excellent comments about regionality is important, right? So if in community B, a large employer opens a warehouse, we see, 800 jobs open because of that warehouse, and they hire over an extended period of time, it does not mean that there will be warehousing jobs in that community in the future. That's what I described as labor market intelligence, right? That they've got to go into their own community if they see a store or something opening up, or, one of the things that's a very good planning board in the US in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is known now for other things related to an election. But, one of their mottos was the moment that a shovel goes in the ground, that's when you start thinking about jobs opening up, whether it's in the construction, the employment that will come from those facilities. That is something that an employment counselor can do that labor market information cannot, right? And as I always like to say, and I steal the line from, I think it was the Washington Post that was looking at how accurate labor market projections had been over the years, right? And they said there's been 40 years of forecasting excellence unencumbered by accuracy, right? That we need to understand that things that happen on the community level go beyond data, and in many ways may be more accurate.
I think that's a really good point, and it's a nice segue to what I think was going to be our final question. And that is, how can businesses and employers be better engaged in the development of LMI resources to guide students and job seekers into exploring careers and fields with acute labor shortages? So in careers, particularly those with acute labor shortages, how can we better engage businesses and employers to develop LMI resources to guide and, I guess, target those students and job seekers into those areas? Does anyone have any thoughts on strategies that could be used? John?
Yeah, and I'll start off with one of these as well, and this may have to be with, you know, when we talk to employers and as we talk to kids, immigrants, newcomers, and others. One of the prevailing signals that's been in our labor market for a long time is people's willingness to relocate. This is the big underlying thing that we've seen through polling in both Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. Ironically, as we have more mobility, right, in terms of car ownership, transportation, et cetera, people are actually less likely to move, right? Toronto gets like 80% of Ontario's immigrants, right? We go to communities that are what I would describe as falling off the demographic cliff, right? So employers, whether they're a small automotive manufacturer in Southwestern Ontario or mine in Northern Ontario, they suffer really acute labor shortages because people are not as willing to move now as they were previously. And we need to work with employers to figure out, how do we increase labor mobility?
Yeah, and John, just to add to that, I mean, you know, engaging employers is a challenge. It's been a challenge for as long as I've been involved in workforce development, and it's more years than I care to recall. You know, employers wear many hats. And, you know, they're, especially when we're looking at our small businesses, you know, they're the sales rep, they're the HR manager, they're the financial manager, you know, oftentimes they're the janitor, right? They're doing everything that they need to do in order to keep their business moving forward and being successful. And so every minute of every day is crucial. So to the question of how do we do a better job, I had the opportunity to speak. It was a project that I was doing in Hamilton, and a very renowned business leader. I asked that question as part of the session that we were doing, and his response was, "Come to me. Don't expect me to come to you. If you've got something important enough to ask me, come to me." So whether that means I'm picking up the phone and calling them, whether that means I'm sending them a personal email to say, "I really need your input on this survey," but find a way to go to their space and have the conversation. Make sure your conversation is well qualified, and make sure that any question that you're asking is a really important question that you need their input on, because they don't have time to answer a 20-question questionnaire. You know, so give them 4. What are the most important questions that we need their input on? And, you know, employers need it when they need it. So until they're in the need for that skill or that new person to fill that vacancy, they're not thinking about it yesterday. But if they find out they need it this morning, they're going to think about it this morning. So make it easy for them to know where to go to get the help it is that they're looking for.
Great, that's really aligned with my experience too, Trudy. Does anyone else want to chime in? We've got about, Tony?
Yeah, I very much agree with what John and Trudy were saying. From a data perspective, I think there's a lot that could be done, and it's extremely challenging with employers. Employers have a huge amount of information over what the jobs are like, what people are getting paid, what career pathways are like, and so on. And there's a whole host of completely legitimate business reasons not to share that information, which I fully understand. But moving towards more openness of sharing that data in an anonymous way so that implicating business is, I think, would be very, very helpful. But to do that practically, there needs to be some kind of more consistent language, to the point I think Trudy might have mentioned it earlier, especially skills and work requirements. Everybody, every firm has their own sort of way of categorizing these things. And if we can move them towards a common language around what those work requirements are, I don't really know how to do that, but that would make a big difference in getting that information out there. And related to getting that information out of the firms, which I think they have a collective interest in, but not an individual interest in. Nobody wants to fill out a survey. I don't like filling out surveys, even though I recognize the importance of them. But most firms are tracking this type of information in an automated way. There are ways to share that kind of information, administrative data effectively, that doesn't put a lot of burden on in terms of time and whatever for the individuals working there. So I think a bit more openness and agreement to move towards consistent language would be a big step moving towards solving this challenge here, but just on the data side.
Perfect, thank you. I think for me, one of the big takeaways from this really interesting discussion has been how, I think Trudy said it the best probably, how data is really keenly important, but we need to tell the story behind the data. And I think perhaps that's one of the big challenges that the published sources of LMI face, is they tend to be dashboards and lots of data, but what does that mean to me? And then you need the other piece of the puzzle of mentorship and career talks and having alumni talk to them to fill that gap. But I don't know whether there's any way at all that somehow those two things can be better married in our accessible online sources. So I found that was a really important theme. I think common language is also a really important takeaway, especially around skill language and soft skills, hard skills, job requirements, all of that kind of thing. I think, I think that was a really key lesson as well. And many other little insights. I've been writing notes, which I'm looking forward to reading, because sometimes I write without thinking. So this has been great. Well, I wanted to really thank all of you, 4 of you, for taking times out of your very, very busy schedules to be with us today and to share your insights. It's been really, really useful, I think, and certainly I appreciate it. And I imagine the 100 or so people that are on today's webcast also have appreciated it. We were talking about how everyone hates surveys. I would hope, even though we may hate doing it, I would really encourage everyone to fill out ours, which is, as I mentioned, the link is on the webcast page, and we'll be sending it out to you afterwards. And I just also wanted to note that we've been recording today's session. I should have remembered to say that at the beginning, but I didn't. We're recording today's session, and you can watch it and share it with others after the session. So I'll also include that in a follow-up email to all the participants. So I think I'm finishing almost, right? Oh, 2 minutes to spare. If anyone has a final comment they'd like to make in our remaining 2 minutes, there is a chance, but if not, thank you so much for joining us today. And as I say, we'll be following up by email to the participants. Thank you.
Thanks
for having us.
Thank you so much.